William Bill Hartwell had survived 18 years of darkness, but tonight the Colorado blizzard threatened to kill him in ways blindness never could. The howling wind cut through his jacket like shrapnel, each gust a reminder of mortality he'd cheated too many times before. His white cane tapped frantically against snowdrifts that hadn't existed an hour ago. Then he heard it, a sound that stopped his blood cold. Not the wind's shriek, but something weaker, desperate. A whimper so faint it might have been his imagination, yet so achingly familiar it dragged him back to desert sand and burning Humvees. Bill's scarred hands trembled as he followed the sound. There, barely visible against the white death surrounding them both, lay a German shepherd puppy. Dark fur matted with ice, tiny chest barely rising. The mother's still form nearby told the rest of the story. "Jesus," Bill whispered, scooping the dying creature against his chest. The puppy's fading heartbeat echoed his own racing pulse. In 18 years of surviving what he shouldn't have, Bill Hartwell was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes with 4 paws. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. For 18 years, William Hartwell had lived in a world measured by footsteps and familiar sounds. His single-wide trailer on the outskirts of Durango sat like a forgotten afterthought at the end of Maple Street, where the pavement cracked and city maintenance forgot to venture. The neighbors knew him as the blind veteran who kept to himself, bought groceries every Tuesday at Rodriguez Market, and never caused trouble. What they didn't know was that Bill had chosen this isolation like a man choosing his own prison. The disability checks came regularly, enough for beans and bread and the heating bills that kept him alive through Colorado winters. He'd refused every offer of help from the VA, every suggestion of a guide dog, every invitation to join the local VFW post. Those things were for soldiers who deserved them. Bill's morning routine had become scripture over the years. Coffee at 6, instant and black. Feel his way to the kitchen table where yesterday's newspaper lay unread, same as every day for 18 years. The radio played the same classic country stations that reminded him of better times before the desert, before the explosion that stole his sight and left him with memories that cut deeper than shrapnel. The trailer held secrets in its shadows. In the bedroom dresser, beneath layers of folded shirts, lay a Medal of Honor he'd never earned. On the mantel, 3 picture frames face down, their contents too painful to display. The kitchen cabinet held an unused dog bowl, purchased years ago in a moment of weakness, never removed out of stubborn hope that someday he might be worthy of companionship. His daily walk followed the same path. Left out the front door, 47 steps to the sidewalk, right toward town. The white cane tapped out Morse code messages only he understood. Crack in the pavement here, fire hydrant there, Mrs. Hutchins watering her garden and watching him with curious eyes. He'd sit on the park bench for exactly 30 minutes, listening to children play games he couldn't see, then retrace his steps home. Bill had survived 2 tours in Iraq, an IED blast that should have killed him, and 18 years of darkness that followed. He'd learned to navigate his small world with military precision, every movement calculated, every danger anticipated. The blizzard that descended on Durango that December evening was just another enemy to outmaneuver. But enemies, Bill had learned, sometimes came disguised as gifts. The German shepherd puppy, now lying on his couch, was barely 4 months old, all oversized paws and floppy ears. Bill had toweled him dry, wrapped him in an old army blanket, and managed to get some warm milk down his throat. The puppy's breathing had steadied, his tiny heart beating strong against Bill's chest as they'd sat through the long night. When morning came, Bill realized he hadn't thought about dying once since bringing the puppy home. For the first time in 18 years, something other than survival had occupied his mind. The puppy Bill had decided to call Ranger woke him at dawn, not with barking or whining, but with a gentle paw pressed against his chest. It was the same gesture Bill remembered from his military days, the way trained dogs alerted their handlers. But this was impossible. Ranger was barely 4 months old, untrained, a stray found dying in a blizzard. Bill sat up slowly, his joints protesting the cold morning air. Ranger hopped down from the couch and padded toward the front door, then stopped and looked back. Even blind, Bill could feel those eyes on him, patient and expectant. When he didn't move immediately, Ranger returned and pressed his nose against Bill's hand, then walked back to the door. "You need to go out, boy?" Bill's voice was rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken this much in years. Following the sound of Ranger's breathing, Bill made his way to the door. The moment he opened it, Ranger darted outside, did his business quickly, and returned to Bill's side before the cold could seep through the doorframe. That first walk changed everything Bill thought he knew about survival. Ranger positioned himself perfectly at Bill's left side, his small body brushing against Bill's leg with each step. When Bill veered too close to Mrs. Hutchins' garden gnome, Ranger gently pressed against his leg, guiding him back to the center of the sidewalk. At the intersection of Maple and 3rd, where Bill always paused to listen for traffic, Ranger stopped before Bill's cane even detected the curb. "How do you know to do that?" Bill whispered, his hand finding the puppy's head. Ranger leaned into the touch, his tail wagging softly. The walk that usually took Bill 25 minutes of careful navigation was completed in 15. Ranger seemed to anticipate every obstacle, every turn, every hazard. When they reached the park bench where Bill always rested, Ranger sat beside it and waited. By the second day, Bill realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Ranger didn't just guide him. He seemed to understand Bill's needs before Bill himself recognized them. When Bill's blood sugar dropped during his afternoon insulin routine, Ranger appeared at his side with the glucose tablets from the kitchen counter. When Bill dozed off in his chair, Ranger woke him before the prescribed nap time ended, preventing the disorientation that always followed oversleeping. The puppy was learning Bill's schedule with frightening accuracy. More unsettling, he was responding to commands Bill had never taught him. "Ranger, heel," Bill said during their 3rd walk, using the military command out of habit. The puppy immediately snapped to perfect position at his left side. "Forward march." Ranger's pace became measured, disciplined. "Halt!" The puppy stopped instantly. Bill's hands shook as he knelt beside Ranger in the middle of the sidewalk. "Where did you learn that, boy?" he whispered. Ranger pressed his muzzle against Bill's neck, a gesture so familiar it sent ice through his veins. Another dog had done that once, a lifetime ago in the desert sand. Tommy Rodriguez was the first to notice the change. The Mexican-American grocer had been watching Bill struggle through his weekly shopping trips for years, always ready to help, but knowing better than to offer. Bill's pride ran deeper than his need for assistance. "That's some dog you got there, Bill," Tommy said, as Bill navigated the narrow aisles with unprecedented ease. Ranger walked slightly ahead, pausing at each turn to ensure Bill could follow safely. "Where'd you find him?" "Blizzard night," Bill replied, his voice carrying more warmth than Tommy had heard in years. "Half dead in the snow. Looks like he's been trained. Guide dog, maybe?" Bill's chest tightened. "No. Just smart, I guess." But Tommy's words planted a seed of worry that grew each day. Ranger was too perfect, too intuitive. When Bill dropped his house keys in the snow during their evening walk, Ranger found them and brought them back before Bill even realized they were missing. When the mailman approached the trailer, Ranger positioned himself protectively but without aggression, somehow knowing the difference between threat and routine. On the 4th day, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins cornered Bill at his mailbox. The 70-year-old widow had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial information exchange, and her curiosity about Bill's sudden companion had reached critical mass. "That dog of yours," she said without preamble, "he's not like other dogs. He's just a puppy, Mrs. Hutchins. My late husband trained dogs for the police department. 30 years of experience. He used to say you could tell a natural from a trained dog by their eyes." She paused, studying Ranger, who sat perfectly still beside Bill. "That one's got the eyes of a dog who's seen things. Old eyes in a young face." Bill felt Ranger press closer to his leg. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you ought to take him to Dr. Mitchell. Get him checked proper. Dogs that smart, sometimes they belong to somebody." The words hit Bill like shrapnel. The possibility that Ranger might belong to someone else, that this miraculous companionship might be temporary, was almost unbearable. For 4 days, he'd experienced something he'd thought lost forever. Purpose, connection, hope. The thought of returning to his previous existence felt like facing another kind of blindness. That evening, as Ranger curled against his chest on the couch, Bill made a decision that would change both their lives. He would take the puppy to Dr. Mitchell, but not to find his owner. He would take him to make sure Ranger was healthy, to get his shots, to make their partnership official. "You're mine now," Bill whispered into Ranger's fur, "and I'm yours. Whatever happened before doesn't matter." Ranger's response was to press his paw against Bill's chest, that same gentle gesture that had become their private language. In the darkness of the trailer, surrounded by the ghosts of 18 years of isolation, Bill felt something he'd thought buried with his sight, the possibility of happiness. But happiness, Bill had learned in the desert, was often the cruelest prelude to loss. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of digging themselves up. The call would come tomorrow, and with it, the beginning of a battle that would force Bill to choose between the law and love, between duty and devotion, between the dog who had saved his life and the man who would claim the right to take him away. For tonight, though, there was only warmth and breathing and the steady heartbeat of a 4-month-old German shepherd who had somehow known exactly how to heal a broken soldier's heart. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been practicing veterinary medicine in Durango for 15 years, but she'd never seen anything quite like the German shepherd puppy that Bill Hartwell carried into her clinic that Friday morning. The dog moved with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, guiding his blind owner through the waiting room with precision that would have impressed a trained service animal. "How long have you had him, Mr. Hartwell?" Dr. Mitchell asked as she lifted Ranger onto the examination table. The puppy submitted to her touch with calm dignity, never taking his eyes off Bill. 5 days, Bill replied, his weathered hands fidgeting with his white cane. "Found him in the blizzard. His mother was already gone." Dr. Mitchell began her examination, noting the puppy's exceptional muscle development and alert posture. "He's remarkably healthy for a stray. Good weight, clear eyes, strong heartbeat." She paused, running her fingers along Ranger's neck. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm feeling something unusual here." Bill's entire body tensed. "What kind of unusual?" "It feels like a small implant, probably a microchip." Dr. Mitchell's voice carried a note of concern. "Most pet chips are smaller, but this one's larger, more sophisticated." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Bill's face had gone pale, his knuckles white where they gripped his cane. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. "It means someone invested significant money in this dog's identification system. This isn't your standard pet chip, Mr. Hartwell. This looks military grade." Dr. Mitchell's scanner beeped as it read the chip's information. The display made her frown deepen. Instead of typical owner information, the screen showed a series of numbers and letters. K9MD7834 Atlas. Below that, a phone number with a 719 area code. Colorado Springs, home to multiple military installations. "Mr. Hartwell, Doctor," Mitchell said carefully, "I think this dog might be military property." Bill's world tilted on its axis. The warmth and hope of the past 5 days suddenly felt like a cruel joke played by a universe that had already taken too much from him. Ranger, sensing his distress, jumped down from the table and pressed against Bill's legs, whining softly. "What happens now?" Bill's voice was barely audible. "I have to make the call. It's the law. But Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know that regardless of ownership, this dog has clearly chosen you. That counts for something." The call to the number on the chip connected immediately to a crisp military voice that identified itself as Fort Carson Canine Operations. Dr. Mitchell explained the situation while Bill sat rigid in his chair, Ranger's warm body against his shins the only thing keeping him grounded. "We'll have someone there within 48 hours, the voice said. "The animal is classified property and needs to be returned immediately." Dr. Mitchell hung up and turned to Bill with sympathy in her eyes. "I'm sorry. They're sending someone to collect him." "How long do I have?" 2 days, maybe less." Bill stood slowly, his cane trembling in his grip. "Come on, Ranger, let's go home." The walk back to the trailer passed in a blur of anguish. Every step felt like a countdown to loss, every brush of Ranger's fur against his leg a reminder of what he was about to lose. When they reached home, Bill collapsed into his chair and Ranger immediately jumped into his lap, something he'd never done before. "You know, don't you, boy?" Bill whispered, his voice breaking. "You know they're coming for you." That evening the phone rang. Bill let it go to the answering machine, but the voice that emerged made his blood freeze. "Mr. Hartwell, this is Colonel Harrison Webb, United States Army retired. I understand you have something that belongs to me. I'll be in Durango tomorrow morning to retrieve military property that was unlawfully removed from a classified breeding program. Have the animal ready for transport." The voice was cold, authoritative, and absolutely final. But there was something else beneath the military bearing, a personal investment that went beyond duty. Bill spent that night holding Ranger close, memorizing the feel of his fur, the sound of his breathing, the way he pressed his paw against Bill's chest in their private gesture of connection. 18 years of darkness had taught him to live without hope. But 5 days with Ranger had reminded him what hope felt like. Losing it again might kill him. As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, Bill made a decision that would have terrified him a week ago. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. "Ranger," he said, scratching behind the puppy's ears, "I don't know what's coming, but I need you to know something. These 5 days with you have been the best I've had since I lost my sight. You saved my life, boy. Not from the blizzard, but from giving up entirely." Ranger responded by licking Bill's face, then settling into his familiar position pressed against his chest. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The knock at the door came at precisely 1000 hours, military punctuality that Bill recognized from his own service days. Through the thin walls of the trailer, he could hear a car engine idling, official and ominous. "Mr. Hartwell, Colonel Webb, open the door, please." Bill's hands shook as he made his way to the front of the trailer, Ranger walking beside him with unusual tension in his small body. The puppy seemed to sense the threat approaching, his ears alert and his posture protective. "I said open the door, Mr. Hartwell. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Bill's hand hovered over the door handle. Everything in his military training told him to obey the authority in that voice, but everything in his heart told him to fight for the one good thing that had entered his life in 18 years of darkness. "Ranger," he whispered, "whatever happens next, remember that someone loved you." The pounding on the door grew more insistent. "Mr. Hartwell, you are currently in possession of classified military property. I have legal authority to retrieve that animal by any means necessary." Bill opened the door. Colonel Harrison Webb stood on the small porch like a monument to military bearing. Even at 62, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a career officer. His gray eyes swept over Bill with clinical assessment before settling on Ranger, who had positioned himself protectively between Bill's legs. "Colonel," Bill said, his own military training surfacing despite his fear. "Sir?" "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your service to our country, but that doesn't give you the right to steal military assets." Webb's voice was ice-cold efficiency. "That animal represents years of selective breeding and thousands of dollars in government investment. He belongs with the military." Bill felt Ranger press closer against his legs. "With respect, sir, he's just a puppy. He was dying when I found him." "That puppy is Atlas 7. Offspring of the most decorated military working dog in recent history. His father died serving this country, and his genetic line is too valuable to waste on civilian pet ownership." The words hit Bill like physical blows. This wasn't just about military property. This was personal for Webb. But Bill had his own personal investment now. "He's not property to me, sir. He's family." Webb's expression hardened. "Family? Mr. Hartwell, you're a disabled veteran living in a trailer, incapable of providing proper care for an animal of this caliber. This dog has a destiny that's bigger than your loneliness." The cruel accuracy of the word stung, but Bill stood his ground. "Maybe so, but in 5 days he's given me more purpose than I've had in 18 years. That has to count for something." "It counts for nothing in the eyes of the law." Webb stepped forward, his presence filling the small doorway. "I'll be back tomorrow with the proper paperwork. Have him ready, or I'll have you arrested for theft of government property." As Webb turned to leave, he paused and looked back. For a moment, his military mask slipped, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Mr. Hartwell, that dog carries the blood of heroes. Don't dishonor that legacy by making this harder than it has to be." When the car drove away, Bill sank into his chair with Ranger in his lap. 24 hours. That's all he had left with the creature who had taught him how to hope again. But Bill Hartwell hadn't survived 2 tours in Iraq and 18 years of blindness by giving up easily. If Colonel Webb wanted a fight, he was about to get one. The news of Bill's standoff with the military spread through Durango like wildfire. Tommy Rodriguez had been the first to hear about it when Bill stumbled into his store that afternoon, Ranger at his side, looking like a man facing execution. "They want to take him, Tommy," Bill had said, his voice hollow. "Some colonel says Ranger belongs to the Army." Tommy had seen enough injustice in his 43 years to recognize it when it walked through his door. "That's bullshit, Bill. Dog chose you, didn't he? That's got to count for something." Word spread from Tommy's store to the coffee shop, from the coffee shop to the barber shop, from the barber shop to the VFW post where Bill had never set foot, but where his story had been told and retold by men who understood what it meant to come home broken. By evening, Bill's trailer was surrounded by pickup trucks and American flags, a spontaneous gathering of people who had watched him struggle alone for 18 years and weren't about to let him face this fight the same way. Mrs. Hutchins, who had started the whole mess with her suggestion about the vet, stood on Bill's porch with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Bill. I never meant for this to happen. That dog's been the best thing to happen to you since you came home from the war." Inside the trailer, Bill sat in his chair with Ranger pressed against his chest, listening to the voices of his neighbors organizing a defense he'd never asked for but desperately needed. 18 years of isolation had convinced him he was alone in the world. But apparently Durango had been watching, waiting for him to need them. "Doctor." Mitchell arrived after her clinic closed, carrying a folder of documents. "Bill, I've been making some calls. There are precedents for this kind of case. Service animals that bond with disabled veterans, even if they weren't originally assigned to them, the law isn't as cut and dried as that colonel wants you to believe." "What kind of precedents?" Bill asked, hope creeping into his voice for the first time since Webb's visit. "Cases where the emotional bond between animal and veteran was deemed more important than original ownership. Courts have ruled that forcing separation could constitute cruel and unusual punishment for both the veteran and the animal." She paused, studying Ranger, who hadn't left Bill's side all day. "This dog hasn't eaten since the colonel's visit, Bill. He knows something's wrong." It was true. Ranger had refused food and water, spending the day pressed against Bill's legs in a state of alert anxiety that broke Bill's heart. The puppy seemed to understand that their time together was running out, and he was determined not to waste a moment of it apart from his chosen human. Lieutenant Marcus Stone arrived as darkness fell, still in uniform from Fort Carson. Unlike Webb, Stone was young, maybe 30, with eyes that held understanding rather than judgment. He'd driven the 3 hours from Colorado Springs after hearing about the situation through military channels. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Lieutenant Stone, K-9 Operations. I want you to know that not everyone in the military agrees with Colonel Webb's approach to this situation." Bill felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" "Atlas 7 was reported missing from our breeding facility 6 months ago. We assumed he'd died. The fact that he survived, that he found you, that he's demonstrating guide dog behaviors without training, it's extraordinary." Stone knelt beside Ranger, who allowed the touch, but never took his eyes off Bill. "Dogs don't usually bond this strongly this quickly. There's something special about your connection." "Special enough to let us stay together?" Stone's expression grew troubled. That's not my call. Colonel Webb has legal authority here. But I can tell you that forcing a traumatized veteran to surrender an animal that's clearly providing therapeutic benefit goes against everything we're supposed to stand for." As the evening progressed, the gathering outside Bill's trailer grew. Veterans from 3 counties had made the drive to Durango, some in wheelchairs, others on crutches, all carrying the invisible wounds of war. They formed a perimeter around Bill's property, a wall of solidarity that said more than any legal document could. Webb returned at dawn, this time with a sheriff's deputy and legal papers. But he hadn't expected to find 37 veterans camped in Bill's yard, their faces hard with the kind of determination that had once faced down foreign enemies. "Gentlemen," Webb announced, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "you are interfering with a lawful military operation. Disperse immediately or face arrest." An old Marine in a Vietnam veteran cap stepped forward. "Colonel, with all due respect, we ain't interfering with nothing. We're just visiting a neighbor." Webb's jaw tightened. "That animal is classified military property. This is not a democracy." "Maybe not," said another veteran, this one missing his left arm. "But last I checked, this was still America, and in America, we don't take a man's dog without a damn good reason." The standoff stretched through the morning as more people arrived. Local news crews set up cameras, drawn by the story of a disabled veteran's fight to keep his companion. The narrative was irresistible. David versus Goliath, heart versus bureaucracy, love versus law. Dr. Mitchell had spent the night researching, and she approached Webb with a thick folder of legal precedents. "Colonel, I think you should see these cases. There's strong legal ground for allowing Mr. Hartwell to keep Atlas." Webb barely glanced at the papers. "Doctor, that animal's father died serving this country. His bloodline is too valuable to waste on a pet." "With respect, sir," Dr. Mitchell replied, He's not a pet. He's providing legitimate therapeutic services to a disabled veteran. Removing him could be considered medical malpractice. Inside the trailer, Bill listened to the arguments swirling around his life, his future happiness being debated by people who had never felt Ranger's warm body against their chest in the dark hours before dawn. The puppy hadn't eaten in 24 hours now, his anxiety manifest in the way he trembled against Bill's legs. "It's okay, boy," Bill whispered, though his own heart was breaking. "Whatever happens, we had 5 good days. That's more than I deserved." But Ranger's response surprised him. Instead of the usual gentle paw against his chest, the puppy stood and walked to the door, scratching at it insistently. Bill followed, opening the door to find Webb standing alone on the porch, having dismissed the deputy and stepped away from the crowd of supporters. Up close, without his military bearing masking his expression, Webb looked older, more fragile. His gray eyes held a pain that Bill recognized from his own mirror. "Mr. Hartwell, may I come in? I think it's time we had a real conversation, soldier to soldier." Bill stepped aside, and Webb entered the small trailer that had been Bill's world for 18 years. Ranger immediately positioned himself between the two men, not aggressively but protectively. Webb looked around the sparse interior, taking in the face-down picture frames, the unused dog bowl in the kitchen, the military precision with which everything was arranged. His gaze settled on the dresser where Bill kept his most private possessions. "You're carrying guilt," Webb said quietly. "I can see it in how you live." "Punishment disguised as independence." Bill's hands tightened on his cane. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The hell you don't. I've been carrying my own guilt for 3 years now. That's why I need this dog, Mr. Hartwell. That's why I can't let him go." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding. Webb moved to the window, looking out at the crowd of veterans who had come to support a man they barely knew. Atlas's father was named Max, best military working dog I ever served with. He died in Iraq, along with his handler. Webb's voice cracked slightly. "The handler was my son." Bill felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Your son?" "Jason Webb. 24 years old. Best damn K-9 handler in the Army. He died trying to save a convoy that had been hit by an IED." Webb turned back to face Bill, his military mask finally slipping completely. "He died trying to save soldiers like you, Mr. Hartwell. And I've been trying to honor his memory by preserving Max's bloodline ever since." The trailer fell silent except for Ranger's soft breathing. Bill's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. Jason Webb. The name was familiar, but from where? "What unit?" Bill asked quietly. 3rd Infantry Division, 4th Brigade Combat Team. They called his unit the Raiders. Bill's blood turned to ice water. The Raiders. He remembered them, remembered their reputation for going into the worst situations and bringing people home. He remembered a particular day in Fallujah when everything had gone wrong, when an IED had torn through their convoy, when the world had exploded in fire and shrapnel and screaming. He remembered a young soldier with a German shepherd running toward the burning vehicles instead of away from them. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered. "Jason Webb. I remember him." Webb's entire body went rigid. "What did you say?" "Your son. I was there the day he died." "His dog, too. They saved my unit." Bill's voice broke as the memories flooded back. 18 years of suppressed trauma crashing over him like a tsunami. "They saved my life." The two men stared at each other across the small trailer, connected by a tragedy neither had ever spoken about, bound by a loss that had shaped both their lives. Ranger, sensing the emotional intensity, moved between them and pressed his small body against both their legs as if trying to bridge the gap between past and present, between father and survivor, between guilt and forgiveness. Outside, the crowd of supporters continued their vigil, unaware that inside the trailer, two broken men were finally facing the truth about why they couldn't let go of a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy who carried the genetic memory of a hero dog and the spirit of a young man who had died too far from home. The silence in the trailer stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with 18 years of unspoken trauma. Bill's weathered hands trembled on his white cane as the memories crashed over him, the acrid smell of burning diesel, the screaming of wounded soldiers, and the sight he'd lost trying to save others from a secondary explosion that never came. Webb's military composure cracked completely. "You were there? You actually saw my son die?" "I saw him live," Bill corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw him choose to run toward danger instead of away from it. I saw him and that dog of his pull 3 soldiers out of a burning Humvee before the ammunition started cooking off." Webb sank heavily into the chair across from Bill, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. "Tell me, please." The Army report was all clinical language and tactical assessments. "I need to know what really happened." Bill closed his sightless eyes, and suddenly he was back in the desert heat of Fallujah, 18 years old and terrified, watching a young canine handler and his German Shepherd perform miracles in the face of certain death. It was August 15th, 2006. We were running convoy security on Route Irish when the IED hit the lead vehicle, took out the engine block, flipped it completely over. Bill's voice grew steadier as the memories crystallized. "Most of us took cover, waited for the smoke to clear, standard protocol. But your son, he didn't wait." Webb leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Jason grabbed his medical kit and started running toward the wreck before the shooting even stopped. Max right beside him, both of them moving like they'd done it 1,000 times before. The Humvee was on fire, ammunition starting to pop, and these two were pulling bodies out like it was a training exercise." Bill paused, his throat tight with emotion. "I watched Jason crawl into that burning vehicle 3 times, Webb. 3 times. Each time, Max would position himself between Jason and the sniper fire. Taking hits meant for your son. By the 3rd trip, that dog was bleeding from 2 bullet wounds, but he never stopped protecting Jason." "What happened then?" Webb's voice was barely a whisper. "They got everyone out alive. All 3 soldiers in that Humvee would have died if Jason and Max hadn't acted. But when Jason was carrying the last man to safety, another IED went off, a secondary device we hadn't detected." Bill's hands clenched into fists. "I was running to help them when it exploded. The blast threw me 20 feet and took my sight. But I could hear Jason calling for his dog, could hear Max trying to get to him even with his injuries." Webb was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The report said they died instantly. They died heroes, Colonel. Your son spent his last breath trying to save one more soldier, and Max died trying to save your son. They were the bravest thing I ever saw in 2 tours of combat." The trailer fell silent except for Ranger's soft whimpering. The puppy had climbed into Bill's lap during the story, pressing close as if he could sense the pain pouring out of both men. "I've carried the guilt of surviving that day for 18 years, Bill continued. 3 good soldiers died to save people like me, and I've spent every day since wondering why I deserved to live when they didn't." Webb wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his military bearing completely gone. "Jason wrote letters home about that mission. He mentioned a soldier named Billy who always shared his rations with the stray dogs around the base. Said this soldier reminded him why they were fighting because he still had kindness left, despite everything he'd seen." Bill's breath caught. "Billy?" "Nobody's called me Billy since the war. He wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped someone would take care of the strays like Billy did. Jason believed that kindness in the middle of hell was what separated us from the enemy." Webb looked down at Ranger, who was watching both men with those intelligent dark eyes. Maybe this is what he meant. The sound of vehicles outside broke through their private moment of grief and recognition. Through the thin walls, they could hear car doors slamming, official voices giving orders. Webb's expression hardened as his military training reasserted itself. "That'll be my commanding officer. I called for backup when I thought you were just another civilian trying to steal military property." Webb stood slowly, looking older than his years. General Morrison isn't going to be as understanding about the emotional aspects of this situation. "What does that mean?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer would break his heart. "It means regardless of what happened between your son and me, regardless of what Ranger means to both of us, the Army is going to take him. Morrison sees assets and liabilities, not individual stories." As if summoned by their conversation, a sharp knock echoed through the trailer. "Colonel Webb, this is General Morrison. We need to resolve this situation immediately." Webb moved toward the door but paused, looking back at Bill and Ranger. "Mr. Hartwell, I want you to know that seeing you with this dog, understanding what you both went through, it changes everything for me. But I don't know if it's enough to change anything for the Army." The door opened to reveal General Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s, whose silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her cold gray eyes swept the trailer's interior with obvious disdain before settling on Ranger. "Colonel Webb, I'm disappointed. A simple property retrieval has turned into a media circus because you allowed emotional considerations to cloud your judgment." Her voice carried the kind of authority that ended conversations before they started. "Where is the asset?" "General Morrison, there are extenuating circumstances." "There are no circumstances that supersede military property law, Colonel. That animal represents a significant investment in our K-9 program." Morrison's gaze shifted to Bill with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Hartwell, you will surrender the dog immediately. Continued resistance will result in federal charges." Bill felt Ranger press closer against his chest, the puppy's small body trembling with anxiety. Outside, the crowd of veterans had grown silent, sensing that the final confrontation was at hand. "General," Bill said quietly, "this dog has been providing therapeutic support to a disabled veteran. Removing him could constitute a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." Morrison's laugh was sharp and cold. "Mr. Hartwell, that animal has no official training as a service dog. You have no legal standing here." She turned to Webb. "Colonel, retrieve the asset. That's an order." Webb looked between Morrison and Bill, his internal conflict written across his face. This was the moment of truth. The point where military obedience collided with human compassion, where duty met understanding. "General Morrison," Webb said slowly, "I respectfully request a delay in this operation." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that removing this animal from Mr. Hartwell would dishonor my son's memory and everything he died fighting for." Morrison's expression turned dangerous. "Colonel Webb, your son's death does not give you the authority to ignore direct orders. You will retrieve that dog, or I will have you brought up on charges of insubordination." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Webb straightened, and for a moment Bill thought he was going to cave to military pressure. But then Webb did something that surprised everyone, including himself. "Then bring me up on charges, General, because I'm not taking this dog from this man." Morrison's face flushed red with fury. "Colonel Webb, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Lieutenant Stone?" Stone appeared in the doorway, his young face troubled. "Yes, ma'am?" "You will retrieve the military asset and place Colonel Webb under arrest for insubordination." Stone looked at Webb, at Bill holding Ranger, at the crowd of veterans visible through the window. His military training warred with his conscience, and Bill could see the exact moment when conscience won. "General Morrison, I respectfully decline to follow that order." "What did you say?" "I said I decline to follow an order that I believe to be morally wrong and potentially illegal under current service animal legislation." Stone's voice grew stronger. "That dog is clearly providing legitimate therapeutic support to a disabled veteran. Forcibly removing him could constitute cruel and unusual punishment." Morrison stared at her two officers in disbelief. "I will have you both court-martialed. You're allowing personal feelings to override military discipline." "No, ma'am," Webb said quietly. "We're allowing military honor to override military bureaucracy. There's a difference." Outside, the crowd of veterans had begun to stir, sensing that their support was needed now more than ever. Voices rose in a chant that had started softly but was growing stronger. "Let him stay! Let him stay!" Morrison realized that her authority was crumbling in the face of moral opposition from her own officers and public pressure from the veteran community. Her cold mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the frustration of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "This isn't over," she said finally. "I'll have federal marshals here within 24 hours with a court order. You can't hide behind public sympathy forever." As Morrison stormed out of the trailer, Webb and Stone exchanged looks of men who had just burned their military careers for something more important than their own advancement. "Colonel," Stone said quietly, "what do we do now?" Webb looked down at Ranger, who was still pressed against Bill's chest, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "Now we fight for what's right instead of what's legal. And we pray that sometimes that's enough." Bill felt Ranger's small paw press against his chest in their familiar gesture, and for the first time since Webb had arrived in Durango, he allowed himself to hope that love might triumph over law, that kindness might prove stronger than bureaucracy, and that maybe, just maybe, a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy could teach the United States Army something about what it really means to serve. The battle was far from over, but at least now Bill wasn't fighting it alone. The federal marshals arrived at dawn, their black SUVs cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of doom. Bill had spent the night awake, holding Ranger close, memorizing every detail of the puppy's breathing, the way his small body curved against his chest, the gentle pressure of his paw against his heart. He'd known this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it easier to bear. The crowd of veterans had maintained their vigil through the night, their numbers swelling to nearly 100 as word spread through social media and local news. Coffee and sandwiches had appeared from nowhere, donated by local businesses and brought by wives and families who understood what this fight really meant. It wasn't just about one blind veteran and his dog anymore. It had become a symbol of something larger, the question of whether the government served the people or the people served the government. Marshal Rebecca Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, her badge gleaming in the early sunlight. She was younger than Bill had expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen enough human tragedy to understand the weight of what she was about to do. "Mr. Hartwell?" she called through the thin walls of the trailer. "I'm Deputy Marshal Torres. I have a federal court order for the seizure of one German Shepherd puppy currently in your possession." Bill's chest tightened as Ranger pressed closer against him, the puppy somehow sensing that their time together was measured in minutes now. "I hear you, Marshal. I need you to surrender the animal voluntarily, sir. Nobody wants this to get ugly." Webb appeared at Bill's door, having spent the night in his rental car rather than abandon the man whose story had shattered everything he thought he knew about duty and honor. His uniform was wrinkled, his face haggard, but his resolve hadn't wavered. "Marshal Torres," Webb called out. "I'm Colonel Harrison Webb, recently relieved of duty. That animal is here under my authorization." Torres studied the official papers in her hand, frowning. "Colonel, my orders are clear. Federal property must be returned immediately. Then you'll have to come through all of us, said the old Marine who had spoken up the day before. He stood at the front of the veteran crowd, his Vietnam service cap slightly crooked, his weathered hands steady on his walking cane. This dog belongs with Bill, and we ain't moving. Torres looked at the wall of veterans, men and women of all ages, all carrying the invisible wounds of service, all united in their determination to protect one of their own. Her law enforcement training warred with her human compassion as she realized that enforcing this order would require arresting dozens of disabled veterans on national television. "Gentlemen, ladies," she said carefully, "I understand your position, but federal law doesn't recognize emotional bonds when it comes to government property." "Then federal law is wrong," said a female veteran in a wheelchair, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in Afghanistan. "That dog is providing medical support to a disabled veteran. Taking him away is like confiscating someone's medication." Inside the trailer, Bill made the hardest decision of his life. He couldn't let these people, his people he realized, get arrested because of his refusal to accept reality. Slowly he stood up, cradling Ranger in his arms. "It's okay," he called out to the crowd. "I'm coming out." The veterans parted to create a path. As Bill emerged from his trailer, Ranger clutched against his chest like a lifeline. The puppy hadn't eaten in 36 hours now, his anxiety manifesting in the way he trembled against Bill's shirt. "Marshal Torres," Bill said quietly, "before you take him, I need you to understand something. This dog saved my life, not from danger, but from despair. For 18 years after I lost my sight, I just existed. I didn't live. This little guy taught me the difference." Torres's professional mask slipped slightly as she watched Ranger's small paw press against Bill's chest in their familiar gesture of connection. "Mr. Hartwell, I have children. I understand the bond between a person and their pet, but the law is the law." "The law," said Dr. Mitchell, pushing through the crowd with a thick folder of documents, "is actually more complicated than that." She approached Torres with the confidence of someone who had spent days researching precedents. "Marshal, I have 17 cases where federal courts have ruled that emotional support animals cannot be separated from disabled veterans without proper psychological evaluation and transition period." Torres took the documents, scanning them quickly. Her frown deepened as she read. "These cases involve officially registered service animals, Doctor. This dog has no such registration." "Because he's only been with Mr. Hartwell for 6 days, Dr. Mitchell replied. "But in those 6 days, he's demonstrated every behavior required of a guide dog for the blind. More importantly, separating them now could cause severe psychological trauma to both the veteran and the animal." Lieutenant Stone stepped forward, still in uniform despite his career-ending insubordination. "Marshal, I've worked with military working dogs for 8 years. What I've observed between Mr. Hartwell and this puppy goes beyond normal human-animal bonding. Forcing separation could be considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Torres was caught between federal orders and constitutional law, between bureaucratic efficiency and human compassion. She looked at her backup officers, who were clearly uncomfortable with the situation. None of them had signed up to traumatize disabled veterans on camera. "Mr. Hartwell," she said finally, "I'm willing to delay enforcement of this order for 24 hours while we sort out the legal complications, but I need your word that you won't flee the jurisdiction." "Where would I go, Marshal?" Bill asked with bitter humor. "I'm blind, broke, and in love with a dog that doesn't legally belong to me. I'm not exactly flight risk material." As the federal vehicles pulled away, promising to return the next day, Bill sank onto his front steps with Ranger still pressed against his chest. The crowd of supporters began to disperse, but many lingered, unwilling to leave their friend to face the next 24 hours alone. Webb sat down beside Bill on the narrow steps, both men sharing the weight of impending loss. "I want you to know," Webb said quietly, "that meeting you, understanding what you went through, it's changed how I see my son's death. Jason would want this dog to be with you. I know that now." "Then why can't you stop it?" Bill asked, his voice breaking. "Because I'm just one retired colonel with a guilty conscience. The military machine is bigger than both of us." Webb paused, watching Ranger's labored breathing. "That puppy's making himself sick with worry. He knows something's wrong." Dr. Mitchell approached with her medical bag. "I need to examine him, Bill. His stress levels are dangerous." As she checked Ranger's vital signs, her expression grew alarmed. "His heart rate is elevated, he's dehydrated, and his temperature is dropping. If he doesn't eat soon, we're looking at a medical emergency." "What does that mean?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer would break his heart further. "It means he's literally dying of a broken heart," Dr. Mitchell said softly. "Some animals bond so strongly that separation becomes a life-threatening trauma. I've seen it before, though never this severe in such a young animal." Bill held Ranger closer, feeling the puppy's rapid heartbeat against his palm. "What do I do?" "You love him," Webb said simply. "You love him for whatever time you have left, and you trust that sometimes love is stronger than law." As night fell over Durango, Bill sat in his trailer with Ranger in his lap, surrounded by friends he'd never known he had. Tomorrow would bring federal marshals and legal orders and the end of the best week of his life in 18 years. But tonight there was still warmth and breathing and the gentle pressure of a small paw against his chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow, boy," Bill whispered into Ranger's fur, "you saved me. That's worth everything." Outside, the lights of the veteran encampment twinkled like stars, a constellation of support surrounding one broken man and his dying dog. And somewhere in the darkness, the sound of approaching vehicles suggested that tomorrow's battle would be bigger than any of them had imagined. The war for Ranger's future was about to begin. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over Bill's trailer. He fumbled for the receiver in the darkness, Ranger stirring weakly in his lap. The puppy's condition had worsened through the night, his breathing shallow, his small body burning with fever. "Mr. Hartwell, this is Attorney Sarah Chen from the Veterans Legal Defense Fund. I know it's late, but I've been driving from Denver since I saw the news coverage. I think I can help you." Bill's heart jumped. "How?" "I've been researching your case all night. There's a federal precedent from 2019, Martinez v. Department of Defense. A veteran with PTSD was allowed to keep a military working dog that had been scheduled for euthanization because the bond had proven therapeutically essential." Chen's voice carried the crisp confidence of someone who lived in courtrooms. "The key is proving that Ranger provides medical necessity, not just emotional comfort." "What does that mean?" "It means we need to document how Ranger's presence affects your physical and mental health. Dr. Mitchell's psychiatric evaluation, your improved mobility, your decreased isolation, all of that becomes medical evidence." She paused. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask you something personal. Have you been having fewer nightmares since Ranger arrived?" Bill's throat tightened. "How did you know about the nightmares?" "Because they're in your VA medical records, which became public when this story broke. You haven't slept more than 3 hours consecutively in 18 years, but your neighbors report that you've been sleeping through the night since you found Ranger." It was true. For 6 nights, Bill had slept without the dreams that usually dragged him back to Fallujah, back to the explosion that had stolen his sight and left him drowning in survivor's guilt. Ranger's warm presence against his chest had somehow kept the demons at bay. "I can be there in 4 hours," Chen continued, "but I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to call Dr. Mitchell and have her document Ranger's current medical crisis. If that dog is dying from separation anxiety before he's even been separated, that's powerful evidence of the therapeutic bond. As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, Bill found himself surrounded by more people than had entered his trailer in 18 years. Dr. Mitchell worked quietly to stabilize Ranger while Attorney Chen spread legal documents across his small kitchen table. Webb paced the tiny space like a caged animal, his own guilt and determination filling the air with tension. "The federal marshals will be back in 6 hours, Chen announced, looking up from her laptop. "I filed an emergency injunction with the federal district court, but we need a judge willing to hear us on a Sunday." "What are the odds?" Webb asked. "Better than they were yesterday. The story has gone national. Senators are getting calls. The VA Secretary's office issued a statement supporting veterans' rights to emotional support animals." Chen's expression remained cautiously optimistic. "Public pressure doesn't always translate to legal victory, but it helps." Dr. Mitchell looked up from Ranger's examination, her face grim. "His condition is critical. Blood pressure dropping, severe dehydration, and he's still refusing food. If we don't stabilize him soon, we're looking at organ failure." "Can you save him?" Bill asked, his voice breaking. "I can treat the symptoms, but the underlying cause is psychological trauma. He's grieving, Bill. He thinks he's losing his pack." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In some ways, forced separation from a bonded partner can be as traumatic for a dog as losing a child is for a human." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Webb stopped pacing, his face pale with recognition. "That's what this has been about, hasn't it? Not just military property or legal precedent. This is about grief. Mine, yours, and now his." Before anyone could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. But these weren't federal marshals. These were news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like electronic prayers. By 8 o'clock, Bill's small trailer was the center of a media circus that had transformed sleepy Durango into the unlikely battleground for a national debate about veterans' rights. Reporter Jessica Martinez from CNN knocked on the door first, her camera crew respectfully staying outside. "Mr. Hartwell, the country is watching your story. People want to know, what does Ranger mean to you?" Bill looked down at the dying puppy in his arms, feeling the weight of words he'd never spoken aloud. "He means I remember what it's like to be needed. For 18 years, I've been a burden. To the VA, to my neighbors, to society. But Ranger needs me. He chose me. That makes me feel human again." The interview lasted 20 minutes. Bill's voice growing stronger as he talked about the puppy who had guided him through snowstorms and nightmares, who had given him a reason to wake up each morning. When it aired on the noon news, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Attorney Chen's phone buzzed constantly with updates. "Senator Williams' office just called. She's demanding a congressional hearing on military working dog policies. The American Legion issued a statement supporting your case." "And—" she paused, checking her messages. "Judge Patricia Hawkins has agreed to hear our emergency injunction at 2 o'clock. "What does that mean?" Bill asked. "It means we have a chance." The federal courthouse in Grand Junction was a fortress of gray stone and bureaucratic authority, its columns rising like judgmental sentinels against the Colorado sky. Bill had never been inside a federal courthouse, and the echoing hallways filled him with dread that had nothing to do with his blindness. Judge Hawkins was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen every form of human tragedy the law could address. She listened patiently as federal prosecutor David Manning outlined the government's case for property seizure. "Your Honor," Manning argued, "this is a simple matter of federal property law. The animal in question was bred at government expense for government purposes." Emotional attachment does not supersede legal ownership. Attorney Chen rose to respond, her voice carrying the passion of someone who understood what was really at stake. Your Honor, this case is about more than property law. It's about whether the government can inflict psychological torture on a disabled veteran by forcibly removing his medical support animal. She presented Dr. Mitchell's medical documentation, the sleep studies showing Bill's improved rest patterns, the mobility assessments demonstrating his increased independence. Most powerfully, she presented video evidence of Ranger's current medical crisis, the puppy's labored breathing, his refusal to eat, his desperate clinging to Bill's shirt. Your Honor, Chen continued, the government argues that property rights supersede human welfare. But the Martinez precedent established that therapeutic bonds can take legal precedence over original ownership, especially when separation would cause medical harm to a disabled veteran. Judge Hawkins studied the medical reports, her expression unreadable. Attorney Chen, the Martinez case involved a dog scheduled for euthanization. This animal was not abandoned or discarded. It was reported stolen. Not stolen, Your Honor. Rescued. Mr. Hartwell found this puppy dying in a blizzard and provided life-saving care. The therapeutic bond developed naturally without knowledge of the animal's origins. Manning stood to object. Your Honor, good intentions don't negate theft of federal property. If we allow emotional arguments to override legal ownership, we set a dangerous precedent for government asset protection. Mr. Manning, Judge Hawkins said quietly, are you suggesting that the emotional welfare of disabled veterans should be subordinate to property protection? I'm suggesting that law must be applied consistently, regardless of emotional circumstances. Judge Hawkins was silent for a long moment, studying the evidence before her. In the gallery, Bill sat with Ranger barely breathing in his arms, surrounded by the veterans who had driven hours to support a man they barely knew. Webb sat beside him, his own eyes fixed on the puppy who carried his son's genetic legacy. In my 30 years on the federal bench, Judge Hawkins said finally, I have seen the law used as both sword and shield, as both justice and injustice. The question before this court is not just about property rights or even animal welfare. It's about what kind of society we choose to be. She paused, her gaze settling on Bill and Ranger. The evidence shows that this animal provides legitimate medical support to a disabled veteran. The evidence also shows that forced separation would cause severe psychological trauma to both the veteran and the animal. While the government has legal ownership, enforcing that ownership would violate the spirit, if not the letter, of disability protection laws. Bill's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited for the verdict that would determine his future. Therefore, Judge Hawkins continued, I am granting a temporary restraining order preventing seizure of this animal pending a full hearing on the medical necessity determination. The government has 30 days to prove that their property interests outweigh Mr. Hartwell's medical needs. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the veteran supporters. Bill felt tears streaming down his face as Ranger, seemingly sensing the victory, pressed his small paw against Bill's chest in their familiar gesture of connection. But Manning wasn't finished. Your Honor, the government intends to appeal this decision immediately. We also request that the animal be held in federal custody pending appeal. Request denied, Judge Hawkins said sharply. Moving this animal now could constitute the very harm this injunction is designed to prevent. As they left the courthouse, Bill realized that they had won a battle, not the war. The government would appeal, would bring more lawyers and more pressure. But for now, for 30 days, Ranger was safe. What happens next? Bill asked Chen as they walked through the crowd of supporters and reporters. Next, we prepare for the fight of our lives, she replied. Because the government doesn't like losing, especially not to a blind veteran and a 4-month-old puppy. But as Bill felt Ranger's breathing begin to stabilize in his arms, as the puppy finally accepted a few sips of water for the first time in days, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Love had triumphed over law, at least temporarily. And sometimes, temporarily was enough to change everything. The 30 days granted by Judge Hawkins passed like a fevered dream of media attention, legal preparation, and the gradual healing of both man and dog. Ranger's health improved dramatically once the immediate threat of separation was lifted, his appetite returning along with his playful spirit. But Bill knew that their reprieve was temporary, that somewhere in Washington, D.C., government lawyers were preparing arguments that would determine whether love could truly triumph over law. Attorney Chen had transformed Bill's modest trailer into a war room, her legal briefs and case studies covering every available surface. The kitchen table groaned under the weight of depositions from veterinarians, psychiatrists, and military experts who had agreed to testify on Bill's behalf. The case had attracted attention from disability rights groups, veteran organizations, and animal welfare activists who saw it as a crucial test of government power versus individual need. The government's appeal is based on 3 main arguments, Chen explained during one of their strategy sessions. First, that allowing emotional attachment to override property law sets a dangerous precedent. Second, that Mr. Hartwell has no legal standing since he knowingly harbored stolen federal property. Third, that military working dog bloodlines are too valuable to be wasted on civilian purposes. Webb, who had become a permanent fixture at these meetings, shook his head in disgust. They're talking about Ranger like he's a piece of equipment instead of a living being with his own desires and loyalties. That's exactly how the military views working dogs, Lieutenant Stone added. He had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged for his refusal to seize Ranger, but he'd found purpose in helping prepare their case. Dogs are assets, not individuals. The emotional bonds they form with handlers are considered useful for operational effectiveness, nothing more. The irony wasn't lost on Bill that the 3 men working hardest to keep Ranger with him were all former military personnel who understood better than anyone how the system viewed both soldiers and their canine partners as expendable resources. Dr. Mitchell had spent weeks documenting the therapeutic relationship between Bill and Ranger, creating a medical record that would have been impossible to fabricate. Bill's sleep patterns had normalized completely. His anxiety levels had dropped to ranges not seen since before his deployment, and his physical mobility had improved dramatically. Most importantly, his social isolation had ended. The fight to keep Ranger had connected him with a community he'd never known existed. The medical evidence is overwhelming, Dr. Mitchell reported during one of her evaluations. Separating them now would be like forcing a cardiac patient to stop taking heart medication. The psychological damage could be permanent. But the government wasn't backing down. Federal prosecutors had brought in their own expert witnesses, military officials who testified that allowing veterans to claim military property based on emotional bonds would undermine discipline and property security across all branches of service. They painted Bill not as a disabled veteran seeking companionship, but as a thief who had used his disability to gain sympathy for criminal behavior. The media attention had transformed Durango into a circus of competing narratives. Supporters camped outside Bill's trailer holding signs reading, "Love conquers law," and "Let Ranger stay." Counter-protesters, fewer in number but louder in voice, carried signs demanding "Respect military property" and "Law and order." The town's small police force struggled to maintain peace between groups that saw the case as representing fundamentally different visions of American values. Tommy Rodriguez had become an unofficial spokesperson for the pro-Bill faction, giving interviews that painted his customer as a man who had sacrificed everything for his country and deserved the small comfort of a dog's companionship. Bill never asked for anything from anybody, Tommy told CNN. Never took charity, never complained about his situation. The first time I've seen him smile in 18 years was when he brought that puppy into my store, Mrs. Hutchins, surprisingly, had become one of Bill's most vocal defenders, despite being the one who had initially suggested the vet visit that revealed Ranger's microchip. "I've watched that man struggle alone for 18 years," she told reporters. "If anyone deserves happiness, it's someone who gave his sight serving this country." As the final hearing approached, Chen made a decision that would either win their case or destroy it completely. She planned to call Webb as their star witness, asking him to testify against his own military service and the institution that had defined his entire adult life. "Colonel," she said during their final preparation session, "I need you to tell the court that your son would want Ranger to stay with Bill. I need you to put Jason's memory above military protocol." Webb was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. At 62, he looked older than his years, worn down by 3 years of grief and the internal conflict that had defined his pursuit of Ranger. "You know what Jason wrote in his last letter home?" Webb asked finally. "He said that the best part of military service wasn't the discipline or the honor or the tradition. It was the moments when you got to save someone who couldn't save themselves. He said that's when you knew you were fighting for the right reasons." "What are you saying, Colonel?" "I'm saying that keeping Ranger with Bill honors my son's memory more than any military protocol ever could. Jason died saving soldiers like Bill. Taking away the one thing that's given Bill hope would be spitting on that sacrifice." The night before the final hearing, Bill sat on his front porch with Ranger curled in his lap, listening to the sounds of a community that had rallied around his cause. Supporters had maintained a vigil outside his trailer for weeks, taking shifts to ensure he was never alone. Veterans from across the country had made pilgrimages to Durango, each carrying their own stories of loss and the healing power of animal companionship. "You know what the funny thing is, boy?" Bill whispered to Ranger. "I spent 18 years thinking I was worthless, that I didn't deserve to live when better men died. But fighting for you has shown me that maybe I did survive for a reason. Maybe I was meant to be here, meant to find you, meant to prove that love matters more than rules." Ranger responded with his familiar gesture, pressing his paw against Bill's chest. The puppy had grown significantly in their 2 months together, but he maintained the gentle intelligence that had first marked him as special. His bond with Bill had only deepened, their communication becoming almost telepathic in its precision. Attorney Chen found them there as midnight approached, her own exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Bill, I need you to know something. Win or lose tomorrow, you've already changed things. The Department of Defense announced new guidelines for evaluating military working dog placements. Veterans with documented therapeutic needs will be given priority consideration for retired military animals." "That's good," Bill said quietly. "But what about Ranger?" "Ranger's fate will be decided by 12 jurors who have to choose between following the law and following their hearts. I've done everything I can to stack the odds in our favor, but ultimately it comes down to whether people believe that love can be more important than law." As Chen walked back to her car, Bill realized that the outcome of tomorrow's hearing would determine more than just his future with Ranger. It would establish whether America was a country that valued human compassion over bureaucratic efficiency, whether the government served its people or its own institutional interests. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the odds remained uncertain. But as Bill felt Ranger's steady breathing against his chest, he knew that regardless of what tomorrow brought, these 2 months had taught him something invaluable, that even in the darkness of loss and isolation, love could still find a way to take root and grow. The final battle for Ranger's future would begin at dawn, and Bill Hartwell, blind veteran, reluctant hero, and devoted dog owner, was as ready as he'd ever be to fight for the thing that mattered most. Outside, the lights of the supporter encampment twinkled like stars of hope against the Colorado night sky, each one representing someone who believed that sometimes the most important victories were won not on battlefields, but in courtrooms where ordinary people stood up for extraordinary love. Emotional message for American seniors, 200 words. Dear friends, Bill Hartwell's story reminds us that hope can find us in our darkest moments, even after decades of believing it never would. At 58, blind and isolated for 18 years, Bill thought his purpose had ended with his sight. Then a 4-month-old German shepherd named Ranger taught him something profound. We're never too old, never too broken, never too forgotten to matter to someone. In our golden years, when society often treats us as invisible, when adult children are busy with their own lives, when health challenges pile up like unpaid bills, it's easy to believe our best days are behind us. But Bill's journey proves that love doesn't have expiration dates, that companionship can bloom at any age, and that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself when we least expect it. Whether it's a grandchild who lights up when we enter the room, a neighbor who depends on our wisdom, or even a pet who chooses us as their whole world, we all have the capacity to be someone's everything. The question isn't whether we deserve happiness at our age. It's whether we're brave enough to recognize it when it finds us, often with 4 paws and unconditional love. Discussion questions. Have you ever experienced a moment in your later years when something or someone unexpectedly brought new purpose to your life? What would you be willing to fight for to protect the happiness you found, even if others didn't understand its value? The final hearing convened on a crisp November morning, the federal courthouse in Grand Junction packed with supporters, protesters, media representatives, and legal observers who understood they were witnessing a case that would reshape the relationship between government authority and individual compassion. Judge Hawkins had assembled a jury of 12 Colorado residents, their faces reflecting the demographic makeup of a state where military service and individual liberty carried equal weight in the collective consciousness. Bill sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Chen, Ranger resting quietly at his feet. The puppy had grown considerably in their 3 months together, his intelligence and protective instincts developing alongside his physical maturity. He seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, his dark eyes scanning the courtroom with alert awareness while maintaining contact with Bill's leg. Federal Prosecutor David Manning opened with a presentation designed to strip emotion from legal precedent. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about the heartwarming bond between a man and his dog. This is about whether the United States government can maintain control over billions of dollars in military assets when individuals decide they have emotional claims to federal property. Manning's argument was methodical and cold, focusing on the dangerous precedent that would be set if emotional attachment could supersede legal ownership. He presented evidence of Ranger's pedigree, the cost of his breeding program, and the potential military applications of his genetic line. His expert witnesses testified that military working dogs were strategic assets, not pets, and that allowing civilian appropriation would compromise national security. Mr. Hartwell may be a sympathetic figure, Manning concluded, but sympathy does not grant immunity from property law. The defendant knowingly harbored stolen federal property for 3 months. The law is clear, regardless of emotional circumstances. Attorney Chen's opening statement transformed the sterile courtroom into an arena of human drama. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about what kind of country we choose to be. Are we a nation that values the well-being of our veterans? Or are we a bureaucracy that treats disabled heroes as less important than paperwork? She called Dr. Mitchell as her first witness, who testified about the dramatic improvements in Bill's physical and mental health since Ranger's arrival. Sleep studies showed that Bill's chronic insomnia had resolved completely. Mobility assessments demonstrated increased confidence and independence. Most importantly, psychological evaluations revealed the healing of trauma that had defined his existence for 18 years. "Doctor," Chen asked, "in your professional opinion, what would happen if Ranger were forcibly removed from Mr. Hartwell?" "It would likely trigger a severe depressive episode, potentially leading to suicidal ideation," Dr. Mitchell replied. "The bond they've formed isn't just emotional, it's medically therapeutic. Separation would constitute a form of psychological torture." Lieutenant Stone testified next, his discharge from the military lending weight to his criticism of military working dog policies. "The Army treats dogs like equipment," he said, "but any handler will tell you that the bond between soldier and dog is what makes both of them effective. That bond doesn't disappear just because someone retires from service." Tommy Rodriguez spoke about the transformation he'd witnessed in his customer, describing how Bill had changed from an isolated, defeated man into someone with purpose and hope. Mrs. Hutchins testified that for 18 years, she'd watched Bill exist rather than live until Ranger gave him a reason to embrace each day. But it was Webb's testimony that provided the emotional climax of the defense case. Chen had saved him for last, knowing that his words would carry the weight of military authority combined with personal grief. "Colonel Webb," Chen began, "you initially demanded the return of this dog. What changed your mind?" Webb looked directly at the jury, his military bearing intact, but his eyes soft with understanding. "I met the man my son died to save. I realized that honoring Jason's memory meant supporting the soldier he gave his life for, not punishing him." "Can you tell us about your son?" Webb's voice grew thick with emotion. "Jason was a canine handler who believed that the best part of military service was saving people who couldn't save themselves. He wrote in his last letter that protecting the innocent was what made all the sacrifice worthwhile." Webb paused, looking at Bill and Ranger. "Taking that dog away from Mr. Hartwell would spit on everything my son died for." Manning's cross-examination was brutal, attempting to portray Webb as a grief-stricken father whose judgment had been compromised by emotion. But Webb's military record and his initial support for the government's position made his change of heart even more powerful. Chen's closing argument brought many jurors to tears. Bill Hartwell gave his sight and service to this country. He lost everything: his career, his independence, his hope for the future. For 18 years he asked nothing from the government that sent him to war. Now he asks for one thing: the right to keep the companion who taught him how to live again. The question before you isn't whether the government has legal ownership of this dog. The question is whether America honors its veterans with compassion or crushes them with bureaucracy. Manning's closing was equally passionate, but from the opposite direction. "The law exists to protect everyone equally, including the government's ability to maintain military readiness. If we allow emotional arguments to override legal ownership, we undermine the very foundation of property rights that protects all Americans." The jury deliberated for 6 hours, their extended discussion suggesting the difficulty of choosing between law and compassion. When they returned, the foreman, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, read their verdict with a steady voice. "We find that while the government has legal ownership of the animal in question, forcing separation would violate Mr. Hartwell's rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and constitute cruel and unusual punishment. We recommend that the animal remain with Mr. Hartwell under a therapeutic exception to military property law." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Judge Hawkins quickly restored order. Her final ruling would determine whether the jury's recommendation carried legal weight. This case has forced me to examine the balance between government authority and individual compassion, Judge Hawkins said. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Hartwell and this animal have formed a therapeutic bond that provides medical necessity. The government's property rights, while legally valid, must be balanced against constitutional protections for disabled citizens. She paused, looking at Bill and Ranger. Therefore, I am granting permanent custody of the animal to Mr. Hartwell under the therapeutic companion exemption. The government will receive fair market compensation for their property, but the animal will remain where medical necessity dictates he belongs. Bill broke down completely. 18 years of held-back tears flowing freely as Ranger pressed against him, sensing his human's overwhelming relief and joy. Webb embraced them both, his own grief finally finding a constructive outlet in their happiness. The aftermath was swift and life-changing. The Department of Defense, stung by the negative publicity and legal precedent, announced new policies prioritizing veteran welfare and military animal placements. The Jason Webb Memorial Fund was established to provide service dogs for disabled veterans, with Webb and Bill serving as co-directors. But the most important change was personal. Bill discovered that fighting for Ranger had connected him with a community of people who valued his contributions. He began speaking at veteran events, sharing his story of survival and redemption. His trailer, once a prison of isolation, became a gathering place for other struggling veterans who found hope in his example. 6 months after the trial, Bill and Ranger moved into a larger house with a fenced yard purchased with donations from supporters across the country. Webb lived in the guest room, having found in Bill the son he'd lost, and in Ranger the living legacy of his sacrifice. On Memorial Day, the three of them visited Jason's grave in Arlington National Cemetery. Ranger, now fully grown and magnificent in his intelligence and loyalty, placed his paw on the headstone as if understanding the connection between his existence and the young soldier buried beneath. "Thank you," Bill whispered to the marker. "For your sacrifice, for your father, and for sending me exactly what I needed when I needed it most." As they walked away from the grave, Ranger at Bill's side and Webb's hand on his shoulder, Bill realized that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in courtrooms and communities where ordinary people stand up for extraordinary love. He had found his family, his purpose, and his peace, not in spite of his blindness, but because of a small German shepherd puppy who had taught him that hope comes on 4 paws and that love, when it's strong enough, really can conquer law. The sun set over Arlington National Cemetery, casting long shadows across the marble monuments to sacrifice and service, while 3 generations, man, dog, and the spirit of a fallen hero, walked together toward a future bright with possibility. Please share in the comments. What has given your life unexpected purpose in your later years? We'd love to hear your stories of hope and renewal.